My name's Mark Brown. I do mental health stuff in the main. A lot of the stuff I do is kind of about making sure that people who experience mental health difficulties kind of have the influence and amplification of their voice required to make things happen, make things change. So I've been working with MHFE over the last year on this project that has been called A Day in the Life, which has been about asking adult learners and staff how their mental health was and how their day was on a particular day. The background to that is I did a project funded by Public Health England a couple of years ago, which was called A Day in the Life, that kind of pioneered that approach a little bit. It's not a new approach, but it is a relatively new approach to take in regards to trying to find things out about how people feel and how they kind of live their life. The original Day in the Life was done on 4 calendar days across a year. And we asked people, anyone with mental health difficulties in the UK, to answer the question, what was your day like today? And how did it affect your mental health? And what that gave us on those 4 days across the year was a kind of really interesting snapshot. So in that project, despite having a kind of national launch on breakfast television when we started, due to the support of Public Health England, we got about 950 odd submissions. They were all written submissions, and they varied in length from about 10 words to about 700. The sort of end goal or the kind of boundary was about 700 words. So we built a specific website for collecting those, and we also used that website to display them. So we kind of had a collector for doing that. And at the end of that year of doing it, on those 4 days, we did a kind of a relatively simple analysis of all of those contributions. What we did was we generated a set of indicators, and we had 2 people read every single one of those contributions and then apply the indicators that we created to kind of looking at whether particular things were present or not in the things that people wrote and submitted. Kind of might be handy if I show you the indicators for the original Day in the Life, just so you get a sense of what these people were doing, sort of sat reading every single contribution. So we ended up with 31 sets of indicators for the original Day in the Life, and they were applied to each one of the contributions. And what we ended up with, and I can show you this as well, is we kind of ended up with kind of gross numbers, if you like, of how many times those indicators were assigned. In the original Day in the Life, because we only had 2 coders, we could only say that the indicator had been assigned to a particular account if both of the coders had applied it. So let me just show you kind of one of the exciting word clouds we ended up with. The word cloud of the topics recognised as having a positive effect on the well-being of the writer in the project. So they were the tags that were assigned, and the size is relative to how often they were assigned. So there's a few more. We've got, there's the negative ones, which we've obviously put in red because that makes them go, oh, that's kind of terrible. So this is not necessarily what people wrote directly, but what was recognised using the indicators by the people who were responding to those submissions. So can everyone see that word clouds? We've got things like negative effective physical health, negative actual experience of mental health services, negative work contribution. And then we've got one which was what was written about the most in that particular project, which is both negative and positive. So what we could see from that was, for a lot of people, the thing that most impacted upon their sense of their own mental health, both negative and positive, was mental health services, then home life, work contribution, friend support, etc., etc. It's kind of got a sort of interesting picture from asking a very, very non-directional question of people. And people wrote whatever they fancied. You know, some of that stuff that they wrote was very, very personal. Some of it was literally like a kind of diary of their particular day. You know, I got up, got the kids up, went to work, came home. Nothing bad happened around my mental health. Others were, I was in hospital. I'm waiting for a mental health act tribunal. The range of experiences of mental health, and the idea behind the project had really been to find a way of bridging the gap between personal accounts of experiences and kind of qualitative data, if you like. So there are lots of approaches to qualitative data. The approach that we took with the original Day in the Life and are taking with the MHFE project is really that it's a kind of crowdsourcing more than anything. And crowdsourcing is kind of sometimes a very confusing idea when people talk about it. There was a vogue for talking about it in health and social sector projects about 2 years ago. It was one of those buzzwords that people use without really kind of getting their head around it. They talk about crowdsourcing stuff, but what they actually meant was we'll just ask people to do some things. Like a kind of more useful definition of crowdsourcing is creating a way of lots of individual people's effort being combined into something that's larger than the sum of its parts. So with crowdsourcing, you have to know two things. You have to know what it is you're collecting, and then you also need to know what you'll do to combine all of the things that you're collecting to make something of value to the world, to the people involved, to whatever the purpose of your crowdsourcing is. So a good kind of definition of this might be looking at the way Wikipedia works. So if you've got Wikipedia, people are writing and editing contributions to a big encyclopedia. So the purpose is to build factual knowledge in a way where the job of that is shared. If that had been a project where people just came and wrote whatever they wanted, without the purpose of kind of aiming towards a really comprehensive encyclopedia, and there was no way of managing and understanding what they contributed, what you just have is the internet again. So it's kind of the whole point of collecting these sorts of accounts in a project like this is you're asking people to freely and of their own volition share with you something that might be kind of quite private or something that might not be used to sharing so directly. Being able to be honest about what their day was like, how they felt. A lot of people feel that it's kind of quite bad to be honest about how they're feeling about their day. So it's kind of asking people to do that, kind of doing something asking them to do something they're already kind of doing in their heads. And then finding a way of combining all of those things and drawing some additional meaning from that. So that was the original Day in the Life, and that went down really well, and is kind of continuing to kind of attract the wonderment and good words of various organisations. And I think the reason for that is it does, in one way or another, point towards a way of bridging the challenges around kind of personal testimony or personal accounts of things and the generation of evidence, and kind of solves what you might define as a problem around generating case studies, I suppose. So in the context of the project with MHFE, the challenge was, in a lot of ways, that case studies don't quite cut it in providing impressions of what was good and what was valuable about, about a particular experience. So when we classically, to take a bad aggregate example of case studies, the stereotypical bad case study is getting someone to write how absolutely awesome your project is, and then shopping that around all of your funders and potential supporters to say, look, our users think this project is really, really great. The challenge with that is it's kind of a tool that is people are very cynical about. So even when you write very, very good case studies, people will often be relatively cynical about the evidence they present. So you kind of have a way in which that kind of evidence kind of strips out, I don't know, verisimilitude or granularity or just the sort of detail and voice of the people that are involved. So there's kind of that challenge. But there's also kind of a challenge around capturing how people feel about things. And people are often really good at telling you what you want to hear, or they're relatively good, often in the same conversation, telling you what they think is most important for you to hear, and kind of asking people to record or write or otherwise present their response to a question like, how was your day and how did you feel, kind of circumvents that a little bit. It kind of moves around the side a bit. So it creates a space where people can kind of say whatever they want, if you like, and whatever it is they feel about the question that you're asking them. And then instead of them doing the job of working out what you really want to know or really want to find out, it's kind of you as the people collecting those responses do the job of working out what it means and what it is you want to find out from what people said. Does that kind of make sense as a sort of difference of approach? Yeah.
There are some comments that we have in the chat, Mark, sure. Related to what you've just been talking about, the developing of case studies, what it is that we include, etc. Would you like to hear those now and perhaps respond? Or
I'm happy to, yeah.
Or, I'll read them loud for colleagues that perhaps are not able to see them in the chat. But to start with, it was with regards to indicators and a comment that there seems to be a positive and it seems like most indicators have both a positive and a negative effect. Is that so?
In the original Day in the Life, yes, that was true, because we were looking at kind of themes, because the thinking behind the original Day in the Life was around kind of public mental health. So we were looking at how present the kind of themes that had been prevalent in discussions about well-being have been, and looking at, you know, the absence or the presence of something, but also whether it had a positive or negative effect. So the example that's worth thinking about in that context is, if you really like your job, it usually makes you feel better, or at least you will say that I had a good day today, it was a good day at work. If you're not keen on your job, or your job's not going very well, you will say that it had a poor effect on your mental health, made you feel worse, I felt rubbish. But generally, in the overall literature, the recognition is that people who have work or are currently in employment are said to have higher levels of well-being than people who don't. So it's kind of being able to pick up not whether someone was in work, but how they felt about it on that particular day, gave something that was different from some of the other literature. Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, colleagues can tell us if that answers the question. Some comments also that, just bear with me, I need to scroll up, that when it comes to highlighting something as a case study, it inevitably makes it a subjective straight away. So there is that acknowledgement in a way of what you've explained there about some positive case studies to illustrate the points, and also a comment in the chat that it is very easy for the case study to be overlooked or dismissed as evidence that has any representative value, and because it's the norm in inverted commas, rather than an exception. Then also a comment that from Chris Truckle, that for me the beauty of this approach is in no way led by an interviewer or questionnaire design, which invariably applies or can be deemed to apply an agenda to any information.
I think that, I mean, that was something we were, certainly with the original Day in the Life and with the MHFE project, that's a really important element of it, because there's lots of interesting challenges around sort of interviewer-led qualitative projects, and there's lots of ways they're controlled and stuff like that. But very often, even when you acknowledge what it is you're doing, there's still a way in which you sort of leave out the original subject.
Yes.
So I know that in a lot of qualitative work, you publish the analysis, but no one ever gets to see the actual interviews.
You've just come to what there is a lot of demand here, and that is that if we can see some examples of the entries, the contributions.
Yeah, so let me do some. So I should say at this point, these are from the original Day in the Life, so the project we did previously. The ones that were collected for the MHFE project aren't published yet, but will be published as far as I understand, because that's a really good thing. So kind of very fundamentally, even if you never read any of the analysis, if you're not interested in what the analysis of those things are, you could go and read and view and listen to what people said directly. And there's something very, very powerful in having a really big pile of things that people said, not just one case study, and or 2 or 3 anonymized case studies, but here is, the glorious, messy, confusing, wonderful, surprising things that people say in response to a relatively simple question. Any of these, if we just go to health, say, what we should see is some entries divided by negative, neutral, and positive. Oh, gone. These are the exciting ones from the original day in the life. So you can see they on the day of 26th of August, and you should be able to click through and just read them. So this is probably quite a long one. Yeah, so I'm not going to read it out unless that's helpful. So this person is saying, today's been a very memorable day for all the wrong reasons, sadly. In fact, emotionally, mentally, it's been the most difficult day I've experienced and lived through for almost 2 years. My previous post was very much consumed by the angst about resigning from my job or not. Well, I have resigned end of May. After initially feeling more grief than relief, I'm now on an even keel. So they're talking about a new factor in their life, and the person's talking about self-diagnosing themselves with a type of skin cancer and having an urgent GP's appointment. Talking about a previous hospital admission. This was me picking one at random. This isn't me trying to find a particularly heartfelt one or a particularly difficult one. So that goes on into a lot of detail about that person's day and their previous day, and even just that is pretty amazing. That person shared anonymously what their day was like, and it turned out on the 26th of August, unfortunately, to have not been a particularly good one for them. Let me show you, I'll show you another one at random. So if we choose a different heading, say if we choose things we do, just go for the first one, 26th of August. This is one that was listed positively in things we do. I'm on holiday this week, much needed after a 3-month stint at work. I'm physically and emotionally tired, but I'm now 5 days in and can finally feel all the tensions from work drifting away. I like drawing and spent today in my studio drawing and putting up pictures. A holiday is a good time to disappear into my art world. Skipping down, nothing else much happened today, really. I'm really enjoying the quiet solitude away from work, hustle, bustle, etc. I've had some moments of anxiety over the last 3 months, particularly in the last week as my mind and body get more tired. Sort of very, very different accounts of 26th of August for that particular person. So there's some examples from the original day in the life, which kind of give you a sense of what you get when you ask people a question that's relevant to them, not necessarily relevant to you specifically. So if we'd ask people, could you tell us what the problems are with the current mental health system and the way that society regards mental health? They wouldn't have told us about their holiday and their art or their skin cancer or their hospital admission necessarily. They would have given us what they thought were very, very useful answers. And that would be a project, but it wasn't that project, and it's not the MHFE project. Lou, have you managed to pull up some examples? See you stop share.
That's interesting. Okay. Can you you can pause share and then we'll see what happens. And hopefully Lou will be able to resume share. Is there a stop share option there?
Oh God. Okay, let me just describe.
Lou, I have just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share.
Brilliant, thank you.
Excellent.
Here we go. So just so you can see how they appear, and this is one. Today I attended my WellBeing Out class. I love the class, and even though I'm not a big fan of watercolours or seascapes, I managed to produce something that resembled the sea in the sky. The tutor always makes you feel that like anything is possible, and that in art there are no mistakes. Just let your creativity flow. It's a really positive experience, and I always feel proud of myself and proud of the work I've done. It's a good feeling, and I'm looking forward to next week's class. And we also had examples of, just open one up, and just literally opening one up at random here, examples of people's artwork, which you know, sometimes was really clearly involved words, involved sort of heads and things that clearly was about expressing how they felt and how they felt their mental health was. And sometimes was just drawings. So actually what was evocative here were the colours and, you know, all sorts of different messages around what they chose to share with us. And I think the project itself has been really respectful of how people chose to share their thoughts and make their contributions. And I just wanted to give a little flavour of that. I've picked absolutely at random here, so you know, just so you could see. Thanks a lot, Mark, for letting me do
show. So I'm just going to try and share screen now, and then I can share that. And this is one of the ones we looked at the workshop recently. I can't rotate it, so you're going to bear with me with the fact that I can't rotate this one, but I'm just going to computer sound and then just share this one with you. Okay, so
of the year today, and it's a beautiful one, really hot. When I got up, I was anticipating that the day would be quite busy and feel long, and I had a lot to do. And I got on the bus, and it was late, and the driver changed over halfway through the journey, so I was a little bit late, and it was a bit stressful, but I got to the place where I was going, the community centre, and I saw my colleague, who is lovely, and I talked to a few people as part of the research, and I guess, you know, as soon as you start talking to people and focus yourself and listen to people's stories and make those connections, it made me feel better too, kind of lose myself in it, and that's a good thing. So coming here this afternoon and making these short videos and listening to people and hearing what they have to say about the effect of this project on their lives, it's been a really good experience. I think the main thing that seems to be coming out of people's experiences that has brought people together, and that they've kind of shared their experiences and found some solidarity and compassion, and that makes life easier.
Yeah. So these are the indicators that we kind of worked out to try and look at all of the contributions and see what they tell us about, kind of in aggregate, what people were experiencing or getting out of or finding out about themselves from their involvement in community learning, involvement in this project. So we got not so many that are really sort of mental health specific, and the majority of them are kind of about the quality of your life, like how you feel and what things mean to you. So for instance, we got one there which is expressed a state of belonging positively. The contribution indicates the person who submitted it was feeling more part of something and that they belong. Community, establishment, place they live, place they work, place they learn, place they socialise. Then we've got expressed state of belonging negatively. The contribution indicates the person who submitted it was feeling less like they fit in, and that they feel less like there's a place for them in their community, in learning, in life, in their families. People might say either of those things in their contribution, or they might say none of them. And that's the way the indicators work. The people who are coding are looking for whether they think that a particular indicator is present in a particular contribution. And then when you add together all of the people who did the coding, you can sort of see whether a majority of them thought that a particular indicator was present in a particular contribution, but then the indicators applied to a contribution get all added up together. So what you can see is, in your big pile of contributions, what the most commonly recognised indicators were. And so you can do the equivalent of that kind of word cloud exercise. It's a way of kind of surfacing the big themes, if you like. You're kind of looking to see whether a theme that you're interested in is actually there, and then reporting back whether it was or not. Does that kind of make sense as an approach? The approach to the audiovisual is slightly different because there's a need to include not just what is said, so not just the content, but also the context, because the context, the what something looks like, how it's done, is as much part of the contribution as the manifest content, if you like. Does that make sense for everyone about how we're getting to the point of kind of pulling an aggregate meaning out of all of these contributions? So give me a thumbs up, a kind of wavy hand.
We do have some questions and comments, Mark, that perhaps if you consider that you can explain how this will work.
Absolutely.
May I just ask, are these the final indicators that you've got there? Is this a version?
There's a final version to be signed off that includes the audio-visual indicators of the audio-visual approach. But I think we are pretty much there. I may have clicked the wrong previous edition of those indicators. So the final indicators will perhaps differ. There's specific indicators for staff. But the kind of glorious thing about this approach is you publish your indicators. That's that, in whatever you finally write up, your indicators are there because that's what you're reporting that you saw. So anyone can look at what your coders were looking at to try and understand the contributions, if that makes sense. So it's kind of all out in the open, the way that you do the analysis. You publish them alongside so that people can read the indicators themselves and go, yeah, I kind of understand what it is you were looking for there. And that gives meaning to how many times it did or didn't turn up in the overall analysis.
So we have Sally's contribution in chat after we've showed some of the contributions, some of the entries, saying, interesting, I bet we all read that image differently, talking about image of two fish, but we had a challenge for you then, Mark. To Sally, it felt like the person was feeling like they were floating along happily because there was colour, with a purpose, going in same direction with others, part of community because it was two fishes, but it may just have been the way that she looked at it, or but it may just have been they were looking in their pond and saw two fishes. How do you code a picture?
That is a challenge and something that we have spent quite a long time thinking about. I think the approach that we're taking is going to be, with the audiovisual stuff, part of it is describing from your perspective what it is you're actually seeing or hearing, and then looking at whether those things necessarily correlate with each other. So hopefully there's a middle ground where all of the people coding recognise some particular things being present, and the kind of ground at the edges might be smoothed out. I think there's still a question of how we represent those findings because they are different. It's a challenge. because you're trying to find a way of combining subjective observations into something that makes sense when you turn it into a kind of analysis. Because ultimately, if the subjective is the strongest thing, the best thing to do is just to go and say, look at the thing and think yourself and see how you think it looks or sounds. So it is a challenge. It's a really big challenge, but it was extremely important for the project to include those contributions. Hello, someone's got a hand up.
It was me. I put in the chat, Mark, I think for me it's been such an interesting, just been such an interesting process. I've had to challenge myself, really, made assumptions about words being like clearer or more objective somehow than images, but actually right from the start, when a few of us have started discussing some of the words that were uploaded, we had different perceptions. So instead of it being an either or, it's very much along a spectrum for me. And the workshop in Manchester, I think, was I was gutted that I wasn't able to go, but obviously talking to colleagues afterwards, there's clearly processes that have been just a massive learning curve and really challenged me. And it's hypocritical for me to think that words are sort of nailed down when we live in this world of spin, don't we, and fake news. So I think I'm talking methodology here, even before we get to the findings. Just been a really fascinating process.
This is why I, put together the original Day in the Life in regards to the words, in that a lot of the approaches that people suggest in terms of analysing written contributions is to put them through a program, to put them through language stuff. And it was always my contention that a lot of the stuff, certainly around mental health, is between the lines. So someone can write 700 words that, for anyone who has a bit of knowledge about mental health, is really obviously about anxiety. But the word anxiety and its most obvious synonyms don't appear in the bit of writing at all. So that's why I'm, with the Day in the Life and the approach, the by eye stuff is really important. And it's, that's why with the analysis we're looking at with this, there's going to be a mixture of people who come from community learning as their primary domain and who don't. Again, because it's kind of not reading between the lines, and it's not attempting to induct anything that isn't present. That's why you use the indicators. So, we spent a long time batting those indicators backwards and forwards to work out whether they kind of have a kind of conceptual validity. Like, are these the right things to be looking for? And then you are applying, your ability to look at something in relation to those indicators. But that's why the by eye thing is for me really, really important. Because if you're just on a word cloud of the most commonly used phrases in the original Day in the Life, the biggest one would just be, when we ask people to talk about their mental health, they most commonly talked about their mental health.
How to interpret people's drawings, really? Because I actually thought those two fish were amazing, and I had different interpretations of them. And I think that we do actually use our drawings to communicate. And sometimes, even if you ask people to talk about their drawings, they don't know what they're communicating. I mean, for example, that drawing, to me, the most important thing about it wasn't what what they'd drawn, but actually how hard they'd leant on the paper. And the fact that it was done with hesitantly and used faint colours. And to me, that gives an impression of somebody who's not fully confident about being there. That's the only interpretation that I would make with it. All the other things about fish and stuff like that, I mean, that has all sorts of different sort of semantic. different meanings for different people, depending where you come from or your context. Or the one thing that isn't cultural specific, really, I think, is how hard you lead on the paper, and you know, whether or not you have gaps in what you're doing, and whether or not you yeah, about the physical activity of actually producing something.
Cool. Yeah, it's that we talked a lot about the difference between kind of manifest and latent kind of content, kind of, you know, sort of intention versus something else. My feeling is sort of coming to the end of this process and these discussions. There is another project to be done around specifically kind of understanding and responding to kind of audio and visual and drawings and stuff like that, because it's really difficult and complicated. And one of my concerns is, in some ways, kind of overstepping into kind of ascribing intent to what's observed. And I think that's sometimes, that might be a challenge, especially when we kind of look at what assumptions we might be baking in around people's mental health, their cultural background, etc., etc. So it's really complicated.
Mark, something that has been asked and I've been reminded to put to you is that, will there be anything differently done for entries by staff as opposed to those by learners?
Yeah, so there's a different set of indicators that are more about the members of staff's experience of being involved in the project as members of staff, rather than being involved as learners. So kind of stuff that is more useful to ask about their experience of being involved in this project. But it's kind of less focused on, it's focused on different areas of experience to the learners involved in the project. So there's two different sets of indicators there.
I'm just fascinated by the methodology idea. Really fascinated. I think when I was doing my PhD, what I learned was really you can do anything ethical as long as you can justify its ethics and you can justify the methodology. And what we've been learning through this process is that it really is an emerging methodology. And Karen made a point before she left about the perspectives of any of us who've been involved in any interpretation of this, but particularly the coders. And for me, if you are explicit about the different perspectives, then that is really, really fine. As a process, it's really helped me let go of some really spurious notions of objectivity that I still had kicking around my head. And I know that from my reading on the PhD, there's a whole body of literature that really supports this way of working. It's really liberating, because at the end of the day, what do we see? We see the actual images, words and sounds of the participants. And that's got to be a really, really worthwhile endeavour.
I think it's kind of just, it's finding a bridge between lots and lots of subjective responses to a particular contribution, say, the way that we can kind of say what all of those contributions mean together, and also what all of those different responses mean together. That's what we're kind of trying to bridge there. Because the absolute best thing to do, if you want to know what those contributions tell you, as a personal response, is to go and watch them or read them or view them. And you can just say that. You can say, well, here's an analysis, but go and have a look at them. This is what learners and staff said. If you think the analysis doesn't doesn't support what we think it supports, just go and have a read of them. What do you think? here's the way that we looked at them, and here's what we found. Here's what we found looking at them. You might find different, but the things are there for you to look at and listen to and read.